Well, welcome to another Friday night. I want to talk tonight about neglect trauma. As I've taught about trauma over the years, it's very easy for people to understand what we've come to call big T trauma. Big, horrific, bad things happening to people that shouldn't happen, that are traumatizing. But we've come to understand that there's also what we call little t trauma or neglect trauma, and it's the hardest thing for people to understand, because big T trauma is when a bad thing happens to you. Little t trauma is when a good thing doesn't happen to you. So it's a trauma of absence. And people go, oh, how can that be terrible? How can that have bad consequences? Like it's something that should have happened to me that didn't happen to me. So it's not like something terrible happened, but did something terrible happen? And I say yes. And all the research is showing that neglect trauma has just as many negative ramifications as big T trauma. But it's the hardest to understand. It's the hardest to quantify. And so for many people, when they look at their life, they go, well, nothing bad happened to me, so how can I have trauma, but yet I have all 60 characteristics of trauma? And so it's really hard for them to get their mind around the fact that they have little t trauma or neglect trauma. And so what I want to do is just take a couple weeks to really dig into this little t trauma or neglect trauma. And I think it's important to say up front that neglect trauma is primarily around the neglect of emotional need. It's not around, sometimes it's around the neglect of physical needs, but usually it's in the area of emotional needs that weren't met. Another way to say it, in light of what we've been talking about over the last few weeks, and this is to me essential, is what we saw over the last few weeks is the importance of attachment, that a child needs to attach securely to their parents. And if they're not able to attach securely to their parents, then it does tremendous damage, that insecure attachment. And that insecure attachment is a form of complex trauma. The child doesn't feel safe, the child doesn't have a rock, a safe harbor, and that creates a very scary world for them. And so what we've seen over the last few weeks is that there's 8 A's or 8 emotional needs that must be met in order for a child to be able to attach securely. And so neglect trauma is when those 8 needs aren't met consistently. So the child can't attach, and that creates complex trauma. It doesn't seem like you don't see any horrific stuff immediately, but over time you begin to see the tremendous damage that has been done because of this trauma. So let me put it another way. Neglect trauma happens when a child isn't able to securely attach at every stage of life. And so are they able at every stage of life to feel authentic, to be able to be vulnerable, to be able to connect with that parent on a regular basis and open up and share at a deep and real place? Does that child feel totally accepted as they go through the different stages of development? Do they feel appreciated? Are they validated? Do they feel nurtured as they go through the ups and downs and pains of life? Are they allowed to explore and follow their passions and their deepest desires and find out who they are? All of those things are essential for a child to feel attached. And if a parent's not able to meet those needs, then the child experiences neglect. And that creates a type of trauma. So I want to add another perspective today from Janice Weber, who's written a book called Running on Empty. and it's about overcoming your childhood emotional neglect. It's an excellent, helpful, practical book if you're looking for another resource to read. And I want to just take some of what she's written about in terms of emotional neglect and just share it with you today in a way that I hope will just help you understand this neglect trauma more clearly. So let me begin by just talking about what does a parent need in order to not neglect their child. So there's really 3 essential emotional skills that a parent needs if a child is not going to be neglected. So the parent needs to be able to feel a connection to the child. It can't be just that child feels a connection to the parent, though that's important, but the parent must also feel connected to the child and want to be connected to the child. Secondly, the parent must be attuned to the child, and so they must pay attention to the child. They must see the child as a unique and separate person from themselves, not just an extension from themselves, but they need to have that allowance of autonomy, that the child is different. And they must see that this child is not a burden or a possession. They're unique, they're beautiful, they're valuable, and they want to nurture that. And then the third thing is they use that sense of connection and attunement to now respond competently to the child's emotional needs. So as all the different emotional needs come up, the parent is able to meet those needs, to respond appropriately to those needs. That creates a parent who is not neglectful. Those, I hope you can see, are very important skills, but not easy to learn in very busy lives, and if you've got your own wounds to deal with. Now over the years, there's been this kind of debate between quantity time versus quality time. And so there's been, you need to spend lots of time with your kids, and then others say, well, you just got to have quality time with your kids, and that debate has gone on. If you can get beyond those ideas of quality time versus quantity of time and realize it's not so much about the amount of time, it's about when you're with the child that you use the time to be attuned, to meet their needs. And if you use that time to be attuned and meet their needs, then the child doesn't feel neglected. But if you spend tons of time with your child but don't meet their needs, the child still feels neglected. And so it's not so much about the quantity of time, though that the more time you can spend, the better. But it's about, are you meeting the child's needs in the time that you're spending with them? That is really the bottom line. And that's what I want you to see. So get beyond just the amount of time, because some parents who are single parents don't have tons of time, and they beat themselves up about that. But realize, use the time you have to meet their needs. Others who've got more time, they think, oh, I'm doing great because I spend lots of time with my kids, but the child is feeling totally neglected because their emotional needs aren't being attended to. So let me give you what Janice Weber presents as the 10 characteristics of adults who've experienced emotional neglect. And you can go through this and begin to see, do you have the characteristics of emotional neglect? That's really what I want you to get out of this. Because for many people, they go, I don't think I was emotionally neglected. But then they begin to realize, well, why then do I have all the characteristics of emotional neglect? I must have been neglected, so I need to go back and look a little more deeply at whether my emotional needs were met. And that becomes a very important but sometimes painful process for them. And so that's what I'm hoping you will get from this. So characteristic number 1 is a child who's experienced neglect, emotional neglect, usually ends up feeling an emptiness. There's a restlessness inside, a discontent, a feeling that something is missing. That's usually there. And often as they look back, they begin to realize that much of their busyness and activities was running from that feeling of emptiness, trying to fill it up with something that at least made them feel full for a little while. And so that characteristic of feeling empty is an important one to understand. So then let me give you some signs or signals that you might have this feeling of emptiness as part of you. So we're going to do a little deeper dive on this feeling of emptiness. So at times you feel physically empty inside. And this is significant because for many, it's not just an emotional feeling of emptiness. At times it actually feels physical. Second one, you often feel emotionally numb. You don't feel emotion, you're just blah. Or you have times where you just find yourself questioning the meaning of life. What's the purpose of all of this? That can be a sign of the emptiness. Or you can periodically have suicidal thoughts that just come out of nowhere. Like, what's the point? Or you go into thrill seeking. So that becomes your way of trying to fill the emptiness. So as soon as you subconsciously feel emptiness, something in you wants to go and pursue an adrenaline rush. You feel mystifyingly different from other people. So you just don't ever feel like you are like anybody else. You don't fit in, you don't belong. You often feel like you're on the outside looking in. So you're a spectator of life. You don't even feel like you're a full participant of life. You're just not totally there. And then you have a deep discontent that often you're not even aware of. It's there, but if you stop and pay attention, you realize, wow, deep down, there's a deep discontent inside of me. And then the final one is that you have trouble just sitting quietly, all by yourself, with yourself as your own company. That just makes you very uncomfortable. You just want to escape that. So those are some signs of emptiness. So that's the first characteristic of an emotionally neglected child once they get to adult life. The second one might be a new term for you. It's called counterdependence. So we talk all the time about codependence and independence and interdependence. What is counterdependence? So I use it in the 60 characteristics of complex trauma as the fear of being a burden or pain. So counterdependent is the drive to need no one. So the fear of ever being dependent on somebody causes you to be, I gotta be self-sufficient. So you're driven to be self-sufficient, never wanting to be a burden. So that's counterdependence. So it can work out that you feel that you must always be strong for others. It's okay if others need you, but you can't need anybody. For you to need anybody would be a sign of weakness, and that makes you dependent on others, and that scares you to death. And you never want to do that. And so that is what's behind this counterdependence. So that is a characteristic of people that have been emotionally neglected, is basically nobody's going to meet my needs for me. I can't depend on others to meet my needs. I therefore have to be totally dependent on myself only. I can never depend on others. And so I am driven to need no one. So let me give you some of the signs of a person who has counterdependence. You prefer to do things for yourself. It's very hard for you to ask for help. The next one is interesting. You've had feelings of depression, but you're not sure why. So all of a sudden you're just struggling with depression, and you go, I don't even know why I'm depressed. My life seems to be going well. Everything seems to be good, but why am I depressed? And it could be possibly, and you need to explore it, this counterdependence thing. You have an inexplicable, long-standing wish to run away from everything. It's just too much, or just to be dead. It'd be easier just to be dead. And that's because you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, and you're afraid to ever ask for help, and it's just wearing you out. You remember your childhood as lonely, even if on the surface it seemed very happy. And that's because you only had yourself to take care of you. You couldn't count on anybody else. You couldn't connect to anybody else. So there was this haunting loneliness all the time. Others describe you as aloof. Loved ones complain that you're just emotionally distant. And again, that's because you couldn't connect with anybody. You just isolated, became your own person, and lived within your own head. You're not comfortable in close relationships. So those are the characteristics of counterdependence. So that's the second characteristic of emotional neglect. Now the third one is, and we talk about this quite a bit, but it's unrealistic self-appraisal. And this can, so you evaluate yourself incorrectly. And this can take many forms. So number one is the should person. I should be doing this, I should be doing this. And you don't accept your limitations. You always think you should be better than you are. So that's unrealistic self-appraisal. The next one would be the strong inner critic. That's always criticizing everything you do. It's not good enough, not good enough. So that's unrealistic self-appraisal. Or the flip side is the narcissistic picture of self, which is I'm better than everybody, I'm great, I'm wonderful. That's unrealistic self-appraisal. And so what I want you to understand is all of these come out of deep shame. So the result of emotional neglect is the child goes, it must be my fault. I am being neglected because I don't matter. And that shame, that core belief that I'm not good enough, I don't matter, I'm not lovable, and that can work itself out in different things. So there's an unrealistic self-appraisal as a core belief, I'm not good enough, I don't matter, and now that can work out to constantly inner critic, beating myself up, or trying to compensate for that with the narcissistic I'm better than everybody else. So we've done a whole series on this shame belief, but let me just give you some of the characteristics of this unrealistic self-appraisal. It's hard for you to identify your talents. You can identify all your weaknesses, you just aren't very good at identifying your talents. You sense that you tend to overemphasize your weaknesses and rarely talk about your strengths. It's hard for you to know what you like and dislike. And so if somebody were to ask you that, you wouldn't know what to say for sure. You're not even sure what your interests are. You give up quickly when things get challenging. It's easier to quit than to persevere if you sense that this is too difficult or I'm failing. You chose the wrong career, or you change careers several times because you're not even sure what you want to do or what you're good at. There's this critical voice inside your head pointing out your errors and flaws all the time. It's just there chatting constantly. You often feel like a square peg in a round hole, that you don't really fit in or belong anywhere. You're unsure of what your parents thought of you or what they think of you today. And so you, again, just have never had a realistic, accurate mirror mirroring back to you who you are. So that's the third one. We've got a few to go. The fourth characteristic of an emotionally neglected child is that, and this carries out of the previous one, they have no compassion for self, but plenty of compassion for others. And so it's way out of balance. They can give all kinds of empathy to others, but they have no empathy for themselves. So what are some of the signs of that? What does that look like? Others often seek you out to talk about their problems because you're so good at being empathetic to others. Others tell you that you're just a wonderful listener, but you have very little tolerance for your own mistakes. There's a critical voice inside your head that's constantly pointing out your errors and flaws. You're much harder on yourself than others. You allow weaknesses in others, but not in yourself. You tolerate failures in others, but not in yourself. There's a double standard in how you respond to others' negatives versus how you respond to your negatives. You often feel angry with yourself. This is such an important big one. Okay, number 5, and we've talked about this, is guilt and shame. So the child again feels, I'm neglected because it's my fault. I'm not good enough. And again, we've done a whole series on that. The next one, and we've done a whole series on this as well, is tons of anger at self. Self-directed anger and blame. And so that can be fueled by shame. I hate myself. I'm the reason why I'm not being loved. My needs are not being met. Why I'm being abused. Why I'm being neglected. Why I've been abandoned. And so that shame causes this hatred of self that causes a whole bunch of anger towards self. But it can also be a false guilt. You were told the reason I'm not doing this with you is because you're a terrible kid. You're a failure. You don't deserve this. And you've been told all kinds of lies as a child as to why you've been abused and neglected, that it's your fault somehow, but it's not. It's the fault of the parents. And next week we're going to look at that. But that can have a terrible consequence inside of you because now you just beat yourself up. That if justice is to be done, I have to punish myself for being such a terrible person, is what comes out of all of that. So that's 5 and 6 rather quickly because we've covered them in detail in the past. Let me go to number 7. And it's what Janice Weber calls the fatal flaw. And we've talked about this a lot, but let me just, again, explain it. It's the belief that if people really knew me, they wouldn't like me, they wouldn't want to connect with me, they really wouldn't want a relationship with me. So again, it comes out of that shame belief system. What are some of the signs that you have this fatal flaw belief? You fear getting close to people. Because if you get too close to people, they'll start to really get to know you. And if they really get to know you, they're going to reject you. It's hard for you to open up, even to your closest friends. You tend to expect rejection around every corner. So as soon as things are going well in a relationship, you start to expect the other shoe to drop, and rejection is probably just around the corner. You avoid initiating friendships because they're going to reject me anyway, so why bother? If somebody else initiates the friendship, okay, I'll respond, but I'll keep my guard up, my walls in place, my mask on, because if they get to know me, they're going to reject me. It can be hard for you to keep conversations going because the fear is I don't want to talk too much because I might reveal too much. And then they'll get to know me, and then they'll reject me. And so again, it's that fear base that comes out of shame, that if people get too close, they're going to see what I'm really like, and then they're going to end the relationship. So that, again, is a common characteristic that comes out of emotional neglect. Shame, which then results in these other things. Number 8. Difficulty nurturing yourself and others. So earlier we said you're hard on yourself, but you have compassion to others. Now this one's different. You might have compassion for others, but you have difficulty nurturing others. And you don't nurture yourself. And it's important to really understand this, because a lot of people think, oh, I have such an empathy for others, that must mean I'm great in helping others. Whereas what they begin to find, they have empathy for others, but they don't have the ability or even desire to nurture others. Something in them resists that, something in them hits a wall. So what are the signs that you have difficulty in nurturing yourself or others? People sometimes tell you that you come across as distant or maybe even cold. People sometimes think that you're arrogant. You often think others are too emotional. You just don't like dealing with emotions. And so any too much emotion, they're too emotional. That's where you go. Others come to you for practical advice, but not for emotional support. That one's important to think about. You feel uncomfortable when someone cries in your presence. You just want to get out of the room when somebody starts crying. You are uncomfortable crying yourself when others are around, or even when you're alone, especially when others are around. You don't like the feeling that someone really needs you. That just feels like too much pressure, too much obligation. And you don't like feeling needy. So all of those are characteristics of people that struggle with nurturing themselves or others. A couple more to go. A ninth characteristic of people that come out of emotional neglect is they have poor self-discipline in adult life. Let me give you the signs of characteristics of a person with this. So you feel that you're lazy because you just have trouble getting around to doing stuff. So you're a procrastinator, you put stuff off, oh, I just don't feel like it today. You have great difficulty with deadlines. That just puts too much pressure on you. You just rather do it when you feel like it. You tend to overeat or drink too much, oversleep or overspend. So you just have trouble with setting and sticking to internal boundaries with yourself around key areas of life. You often get bored with the tedium of life. Routines just become too boring for you. You tend to avoid mundane tasks that you got to do regularly. Like, oh, it's just too boring, too boring. You get angry at yourself, though, for how little you get done. So you don't want a routine. You don't want mundane tasks. You don't want deadlines. You just want to do stuff when you feel like it, but then you get angry at yourself that you're getting so little done. And so you find out then that you tend to be an underachiever. You have so much more potential, but you just never seem to achieve your full potential. You're often disorganized, even though you know you have the capacity to do better. So those are important characteristics to think about. Number 10. And I've talked about this on another occasion, but it's still a fairly new term for many people, alexithymia. And what that really refers to, and it's become common for people coming out of complex trauma, a term in understanding that they have very poor awareness of their emotions, very poor understanding of their emotions. They don't even feel emotions. Emotions have been suppressed for so long that they're not even sure they have emotions. So they can't sense emotions, feel emotions, visualize. It's just there's a block there. Something is shut down deep inside of them in terms of emotions and their emotional world. And that is a common thing for people with emotional neglect that come out of complex trauma. So let me explain some of the characteristics or signs of a person with alexithymia. You have a tendency to be irritable. And so you You got all these emotions that you're totally out of touch with, that are suppressed, but they're still operating below the surface. You don't even know they are, though. The only one that creeps up regularly to your conscious mind is anger. And so you find yourself irritable a lot, and that's because you're just frustrated with having to deal subconsciously with all of these emotions that aren't getting resolved. And so irritability becomes a regular experience for you. You're seldom aware of having a feeling. There's a blankness there. You just aren't aware. This one's significant. Emotions are experienced often as a physical sensation, not as an emotional sensation. And so you might find that you experience pain in a certain part of your body, and you just think, I got a physical pain, when actually that's not how your emotions manifest themselves, is through a physical sensation in your body. A tightness in your neck, in your chest, in your stomach, in your head. All of those things are your emotions trying to get recognized, and the only way they can is through physical sensations. People with alexithymia often are mystified by the behaviors of others. They see others showing emotions and acting out, and they just don't get it because they're so out of touch with that within themselves. But then, all of a sudden, they will just go off the handle and blow up and explode, and they're mystified by their own behavior. Or often, they go into a panic, and they don't understand why. Where did that come from? I don't understand it. And they're mystified by their own behavior because they're so out of touch with their emotional world, they don't even know that they're being triggered and what's going on deep inside of them. So they have this kind of irritability that comes up regularly, but then when they do really get into anger, it tends to be an explosion. Sometimes your behavior just seems very rash to yourself and others. And so this is where you're going along and you think you're very much under control all the time. Emotions don't affect me. I am always in control. And then all of a sudden you're doing something impulsive. You're spending way too much money. You're doing stuff sexually you shouldn't be doing. And you go, what is going on here? This rash behavior. And again, it's because you're out of touch with all of these underlying emotions that are there and are working and driving you. You're just out of touch with it. And so these very rash behaviors come out. You feel that you're fundamentally different from others. You just see yourself as having no emotions, and everybody else seems to have these healthy emotional lives, and you just feel so different. You sense something is missing deep inside of you. There's that deep emptiness. Your friendships lack depth and substance. There's just no emotional connection with anybody. And so they're just superficial. You often find yourself just so unmotivated. And many people with alexithymia just end up being loners and isolators. So that's 10 characteristics of people with emotional neglect or neglect trauma. How did you do? I hope what you can see is that though neglect trauma, where nothing bad happened to you, it's just that good things never happened to you, that should have happened to you, it seems so insignificant, so minor. How can that be as bad as big T trauma? I hope you can see this is serious. This is huge ramifications. This affects all of life negatively. This affects how I go about relationships, how I see myself, how I treat myself. This affects my emotional worlds, my thought world. This affects my behaviors, all negatively. And we could go further in how it affects your immune system, your nervous system, your brain. All of that is part of this neglect trauma as well, and we've touched that in other talks. But what I hope you realize is neglect trauma is not minor trauma, even though we call it little t trauma. Doesn't mean it's insignificant. Doesn't mean it's not as big as big T trauma. It is just as consequential. It is just as damaging. And it creates all kinds of negative characteristics in people. Let me just add this piece because it's so important to understand as you reparent yourself and as you parent your children. One of the unfortunate aspects of emotional neglect is that it's self-propagating. So emotionally neglected children grow up with a blind spot about their emotions. That they're not even aware of a lot of their emotions. And they're not aware of the emotions of others. They're not aware of often of their own needs. And so when they go to parent their children or themselves, they're not aware of their children's emotions the way they should because they're not aware of emotions as much. They've been neglected there so often. They don't know how to meet the needs, emotional needs of their children. And so what can happen is it becomes generational. Their children then feel emotional neglect. It's not like you intended to emotionally neglect them. You just weren't aware of their emotions and you didn't know how to meet their emotional needs. And so that's where this gets even bigger. It's emotional neglect doesn't just affect you. It can become a generational thing where it now affects your children and then can affect their children on and on. And so I hope you realize, wow, I need to take this seriously. I need to find out how this has affected me and begin to heal it and begin to change it and begin to learn tools that I wasn't taught. So let me end by just talking very briefly about how do you heal from neglect trauma. And so the first thing is acknowledge it. Most people, their natural instinct, when I talk to them about their neglect trauma, is their natural instinct is to minimize it or deny it. Oh, it wasn't that bad. It's not as bad as what that kid went through. They got beat every day by their dad. And so they have this minimizing effect, or they deny, oh, I had a good home. We had lots of fun. All my physical needs were met. How could I have gone through trauma? And so there's just this instinct to minimize or deny. It's so important to acknowledge it. To validate, yes, I was emotionally neglected. Yes, it has had terrible ramifications in my life. It's affected all my relationships negatively. It's affected how I've treated myself negatively. Now, what I've found is a lot of people are afraid to do this because they're afraid that they're going to be saying they had terrible parents. And they don't want to do that. And I go, no, I'm not saying you had terrible parents. You might have had wonderful parents in many, many ways. But what I want you to look at is how the areas where your emotional needs were neglected affected you. Be honest about that. This is not about blaming anybody. This is about understanding the impact of what happened to you as a child. That becomes so important. The second thing is have self-compassion. Stop this blaming yourself for who you are and what's happened to you. Stop thinking it's because I wasn't good enough. I'm not lovable. It's my fault. Begin to have a self-compassion. That is so important in dealing with neglect trauma. It wasn't the child's fault that they were neglected. It never is the child's fault that they are neglected emotionally. It is always because of something in the parent's life that resulted in the child being neglected. So don't blame yourself. Thirdly, and this is going to take time and it's going to take a lot of learning of new tools, but learn how to be attuned and attached to others in healthy ways and to yourself. And so usually you have to start with yourself by learning to be attuned to yourself, learning to connect with yourself. Then you begin to learn to be attuned to others, to be present to others, and to connect with others. That is what the biggest thing that comes out of neglect trauma is, that lack of attachment and attunement and presence. And so you got to learn these tools for the first time. And that takes a lot of time and work, and it takes having somebody else in your life who can act as a surrogate parent in helping you with that. I would add that you're probably going to find, as you validate that, yes, I was emotionally neglected and I have neglect trauma, that you're going to go through a time of grief. You're going to grieve that you didn't have the childhood that you should have had, that you didn't have the parents that you should have had. And so that's going to have some anger, that's going to have some depression, that's going to have some confusion, not quite sure how to make sense out of it all, and where, what was right, what was healthy, what was unhealthy. But you're going to go through a bit of time of grieving, and that's normal, that's healthy. Don't run away from that. Next one, be aware that you, because of the neglect, have things today that trigger your neglect trauma. So if somebody doesn't give you the immediate attention that you think you need, that can all of a sudden make you feel, I'm being neglected. And as soon as you start to feel I'm being neglected, you can go to old patterns without even realizing it. So start to understand the things today that trigger you feeling neglect. Sometimes they're legitimate. The person is neglecting you. Sometimes it's actually just you making it up. You're not truly being neglected, but your brain says you are. And so you have to begin to work through that. So every time you're triggered, you go into that limbic brain, which can get quite distorted. And so you've got to get back to your cortex and go, what's really going on here? Is this triggering an old wound, or is this actually an unhealthy thing happening today? And then the final one is, this is such a big topic. It takes a lot of help to explore it profitably and really benefit from that exploration so that you grow and heal. And so I would encourage you to take a program like our LIFT program, our REACT program, so that you can begin to really understand neglect trauma in your life and heal, and get a coach, a therapist, become part of a support group of others who understand that. It is so important. So, when I look at complex trauma, I would say that most of the people I deal with have a combination of big T trauma and little t trauma. That in-your-face, bad stuff, horrific trauma, and neglect trauma. There's a blend. But there are some who didn't have any big T trauma growing up, but they have only little t neglect trauma. Those are the ones that you would say they don't feel like they've had trauma, but they have. And that's why I've done this talk, is because it can be very confusing for people like that to go, well, how come I have the characteristics, but I don't think I've had any trauma? Yes, you have. It's called neglect trauma. And I hope this will help you understand it and help you as you begin to heal from it. Well, that's the end of our Friday night.